Albaih, a political cartoonist based in Doha. Joining us from Paris is Guilyardi, a French journalist and social commentator. And
Sami Zeidan of Al-Jazeera was the host of the Inside Story interview, and his guests were Khalid Albaih and Guilyardi. Interestingly, Albaih is a Muslim cartoonist, and this sort of gave viewers a clue on today's topic of discussion in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. On her part, Catherine is a French political analyst, and of course, we had Douglas Murray to shake things up a bit more.
We have to go through hoops to, avoid censorship in so many levels. We go through censorship in so many levels, social censorship, because of the socio-religious factors.
Zeidan started with Albaih first, by more or less asking if Muslims could in fact take a joke, and especially one portrayed in cartoon form. He recalled that the office of the French magazine Charlie Hebdo had been attacked by extremists for publishing a cartoon of Mohammed. As for Khalid, he made quite a point about being censored as a Muslim cartoonist, and especially being self-censored.
Support what Charlie Hebdo did? The characters.
I condemn what the attack that happened, and I condemn the extremists for this horrific attack. But at the same time, I'm not a fan of the publication. I never was. I thought it was quite racist, actually. And
Khalid also made something clear. He wasn't necessarily a fan of the Charlie Hebdo publication for being so controversial and racist, in his opinion. Although he condemned the attacks. For Khalid, the attacks could have been avoided if the guys at Charlie Hebdo were a bit more discerning. Anyone can come up with a bad joke, but the important thing is, how do you deliver it? Douglas was brought in at this point.
Western values.
That's a pretty atrocious question, if I may say so. We're about 24 hours away from 12 people being gunned down in a newspaper office in the center of Paris, in a European city, because they offended, allegedly, Islamic blasphemy laws.
And Zeidan asked him pointedly if this attack would bolster the far-right argument of Islam being at odds with Western society. But Douglas couldn't help but go off on a tangent by criticizing Zeidan for directing such an atrocious question at him. Rather than answer Zeidan's question, Douglas accused Zeidan of being insensitive to the issues surrounding the attack and the resultant deaths.
And values.
No, you want to paint the narrative which you think turns immediately, not from the attackers, but on the French society, which you would like to portray.
Clearly, Douglas wasn't happy with the deaths that had happened just a few hours prior at the Paris-based publication. And he sorely wanted Zeidan, and anyone else for that matter, to acknowledge that point. What Zeidan was really asking him was the implication of the attacks, and what that entailed going forward. For instance, how should Europe deal with the ascetic aspects of Islam?
So why don't you listen to it, which you would like to portray as somehow anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic or anything like this. Let's start from the fact that 12 people were massacred because European citizens asserted their right, which they have every right to do, to draw Muhammad just as they have the right to draw any other historical figure, which they believe in or don't believe in, it doesn't matter, they have that right. I don't think at this stage whether, a discussion of the far right in France or anything like that is really the point. The point is people were killed and gunned down for doing...
Douglas easily cited Islamic blasphemy laws as the problem, and also mentioned Muhammad as being only one more historical character. So, he couldn't really justify or wrap his head around the fact that journalists could be gunned down for such a flimsy reason. To Douglas, it had less to do with right-wing political ideology and more to do with being able to express oneself as a journalist in a free society such as Europe.
They're French. They were brought up in this country, and they made this choice to become what they've become. They've killed a policeman, for example, who was also from an Algerian background like them, French citizen as well. So I think this is not the issue.
Catherine's view regarding the same question was not to let extremists hijack the conversation of tolerance towards the Islamic way of life. Apparently, one of the officers who was gunned down was an Algerian descent, and the attackers themselves all grew up in France. So really, It wasn't about the incompatibility between Islam and Europe, as Douglas and others like him love to say, but about something bigger.
Affected by extremists just like you are. We are as much scared, and we are the biggest victims of extremist attacks in the world. So because of mainstream media does not tackle these issues, and all they focus on is the differences. They don't focus on how we're all alike. We all.
On his part, Khalid was trying to bridge the perceived gap as the multicultural voice he represented, but the Western media weren't really helping the narrative. Muslims in general were being portrayed in a bad light for whatever reason. And by that, one could argue that it was all in a bid to establish and legitimize prevalent Western worldview.
In the same world, and what we should know about each other, and what we should respect about each other's cultures, and know about each other, so we can live along, like just make a middle line and walk together, basically, and instead of just pointing fingers. So this is what I.
Khalid was also saying that the West ought to strike some sort of middle ground with Islamic communes and values, rather than demonize Islam as the enemy of progress and civility. To be sure, the West has always historically denigrated any form of religion that was at odds with the state. Perhaps Muslims were doing something right that is irksome to Western way of life.
Free peoples have the right to do, which is to draw what we like. And the key message from this really can't be emphasized enough, because, your guest in Doha is a cartoonist. He knows very well that he can't draw a cartoon of Muhammad there. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't, because his life would be at great risk.
I wouldn't do that anyway, sir.
Taking off from here, Douglas was quizzed on policy suggestions for European leaders going forward, but he insisted it wasn't about policies, but about having discussions about security and the freedom of the press. Douglas also tried to rope Khalid into his diatribe, but Khalid insisted he would never draw a cartoon of Muhammad just for the kicks. Something to do with self-censorship and common decency.
Cannot expect, and this is the crucial thing, Muslims should not expect non-Muslims to abide by their own belief systems. You can yourself decide, you as a Muslim do not want to depict Muhammad, but the idea that is coming along in Europe at the moment is a growing idea that people who are not Muslims, who do not believe in Muhammad.
But the point which Douglas was getting at is Muslims should not expect non-Muslims to abide by their laws and belief systems wherever they find themselves. And this was really about being able to do whatever you liked within a free society. On the one hand, you had a highly moralistic movement in Islam, and then on the other side was this highly secularized Western ideology that almost bordered on being profane.
Should fight to keep that freedom of speech. I accept that totally, and I believe in that, right? As a cartoonist and as a human being, and for me as a cartoonist who does not have that freedom to that extent. Right? But at the same time, if you have all these rights, if you have all this power, why would you want to use it to upset a whole population? Why would you want to do that?
Life is upsetting.
Khalid especially cited the problem of sensitivity. While Douglas was all for freedom of speech, there were certain places you shouldn't go because it was bound to offend a section of society. This was the point that Khalid was trying to articulate, even as a cartoonist himself. However, cartoonists at large were known to draw characters like Santa and the Virgin Mary as they liked and not be punished for it. This was Douglas's counter-argument.
Of Muhammad in 2007, and the then editor of Charlie Hebdo, Philippe Val, said, "We're not talking about belief, we're talking about ideologies. Is radical Islam used as an excuse for killing?"
But it turns out the editors at Charlie Hebdo were sued for the cartoons of Muhammad back in 2007. And the conclusion to be drawn, according to Catherine, was radical Islam was being used as an excuse to sow the seeds of right-wing ideology, as in the case of Douglas, or even to justify extreme attacks like the Charlie Hebdo incident. And yes, freedom of speech was desirable by way of challenging radical ideas with emphasis on the word radical. We would like to know your thoughts on this. In your view, What constitutes radical Islam as opposed to progressive Islam? Tell us about your opinions in the comments section below.